presenters, keeping the mics up really close to you. Hello everyone, thank you very much for coming to this panel on food security and rural development. So we'd like to begin the panel today by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians whose traditional lands we're meeting on today, and pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past, present and emerging. And also, on my behalf, I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And I make that acknowledgement of country today on behalf of all our panel members. So we have a fantastic set of presentations today. The panelists have been told that I'm going to keep us ruthlessly to time, so we have as much opportunity for questions from you all as possible, because I think that's the most important side of these sessions. So without very much further ado, we're going to kick off with Nina Fitzsimons, CEO of the Australia-Indonesia Partnership for Promoting Rural Incomes through Support for Markets in Agriculture, which is an excessive title. We need to work on an acronym for you then. And Nina is going to talk to us about the business of food security in Indonesia. Thank you very much. Nina, kick us off.
Thank you very much. So we actually call ourselves Prisma because everything else is too much of a mouthful. I'm here with my colleagues, Ivan Iskandar and Ferdinand Rondong, who are the heads of portfolio for the two case studies that I'm going to be speaking about today. So given that the panel is actually about food security, I'm not going to spend too much time discussing what it means. But just to give you context, we work in Indonesia, and it's Southeast Asia's largest agricultural producer. And so, of course, food security is very important. Of the 270 million inhabitants of the country, 23 million are unable to meet their daily dietary requirements. So there's some more statistics up there, I won't go through them. But what I want to talk about today is using the private sector as a modality for aid development, and how working with the private sector can actually improve food security. So this is our 9th year of our program, and we really see that working with the private sector delivers both in terms of outcome, in terms of scale and how many smallholder farmers can actually be reached, in terms of sustainability, so when we leave the private sector actually taking on new ways of doing business. It improves also in terms of resilience and being able to withstand shocks. And in Indonesia, in the last year, there have been many, many shocks. And also, most importantly for our donor, it really presents value for money. So what does it actually mean when we talk about working with the private sector? There's so many things to remember. What it actually means, most development programs working in agriculture work directly with farmers or through farmer groups or through farmer cooperations in order to lift farmer productivity. What Prisma does is actually work through the private sector. So we do analysis of what's actually happening in that particular commodity, and then we look at the private sector and leverage the incentives of the private sector to be actually able to deliver services to smallholder farmers, both products and services that they are not receiving, thereby increasing productivity. By working through the private sector, it actually means that you can reach scale very quickly. So our actual end goal is systemic change, which means that you actually change the way or the interaction of the players within the market system. So for example, you actually permanently change the behaviour and the interaction between the private sector through their kiosks, through their retailers and the farmers themselves, and sometimes working with the regulatory environment that may be causing blockages for the private sector to be actually able to work effectively. And that's what we talk when we talk about private sector, working with the private sector. What I'll do is I'll actually talk about the end before I talk about the process. So, next slide please. Thanks. If we talk about aid effectiveness, I'll just show a couple of statistics here. Prisma works with 210 private sector partners, so that includes large multinationals down to a small sole proprietor. And they have over 12,500 intermediary service providers. And we're an $88 million program, and that private sector component has invested $197 million. So that means for every taxpayer's dollar, the private sector has invested $2.55 to date, which is amazing. In terms of social return on investment, so for every taxpayer's dollar, the smallholder farmer is getting an extra $6 in their pocket. And in terms of scale, to date we have reached 1.2 million farmers, smallholder farmers, and none working directly with the farmers. It's all through the private sector. So this represents scale, and if you look at the private sector investment, it shows that the private sector wants to do business this way. By looking at their incentives and by working with their incentives, they're incentivized to continue to deliver more inclusive business models. And that's what we talk about when we talk about sustainability. But that gets all boring. Let's get to an exciting story to actually show you how it works. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. I'll see if it works on my end. Yes, it does. This is Mugi. Mugi is one of 1.4 million smallholder farmers, cattle farmers in East and Central Java. In 2015, Mugi had one cow which belonged to his parents, and he would walk tens of kilometers a day to find grass for his cattle to feed, and it would take him 18 months to fatten his cattle. When we did an analysis of the cattle market, we saw that one of the constraints for smallholder farmers was that they didn't have access to good quality feed, or animal health, or access to markets to actually sell their cattle. So what we did is that we looked at the private sector, and the first thing we started with was feed, to see whether or not we could incentivize the private sector to start producing concentrate feed for cattle. There were none, and none were interested in partnering with us. Through the hard work of Trudie, he actually got an in with Holcim, which is a cement factory, which didn't sound very promising to me to begin with, but they had a CSR program because the workers of the cement factory were also cattle raisers, and they were doing a CSR program to increase cattle productivity, or to fatten the cattle of their workers. So we asked Holcim whether or not we could work with them to actually do some feed trials, and all the farmers saw that by using good feed, you could really significantly increase cattle productivity. Now, that work with Holcim got the attention of Pak Munir, and this is Pak Munir. He was not a big company. He's a sole proprietor, but he was what we call an early adopter. And he had done some research on Google and had seen that you could produce better cattle feed. So he was, at that time, was selling about 450 tons of cattle feed, but really he was just flying by the seat of his pants. He didn't really know how to do it. So he partnered with Prisma, and we gave him some technical support to improve his cattle feed. We also, despite his wife saying that she was going to divorce him, he got some training in bookkeeping, and we actually helped him establish, gave him a little bit of a leg up, which you wouldn't do with the multinationals, to actually teach him how to run a real business. And as a result of that, he was actually able to significantly increase the amount of feed he was producing, and then we, and Trudie and his team, assisted with marketing and demonstration plots for farmers, and eventually smallholder farmers were able to start buying Pak Munir's feed. So as Papua started to invest, and he actually invested in a larger factory, all his own money, no co-investment from us, bigger feed companies began to see that actually there was a market for smallholder farmers to produce concentrate feed. And so 3 of the largest feed companies in Indonesia decided to partner with us. And so they also started to produce cattle feed, and started to do promoting to smallholder farmers, and suddenly that creates momentum, and more smallholder farmers are actually using concentrate feed. So within a period of 7 years, going from a partnership of 3 companies, the other companies started to copy what those 3 large feed companies were doing, and now there are 26 feed companies producing concentrate feed for smallholder farmers. But one of the things that we realised is Papua, he grew so much that he actually wanted to export to other islands in Indonesia, and also to other neighbouring countries, specifically Malaysia. However, to do that, he needed to certify his feed through the national feed standards, and what he realised, and what we realised, was that the national feed standards in Indonesia are at a very high level, which means that none of these 26 feed companies, except the large multinationals, were able to meet the national standards. But not only that, the national standards were actually too stringent and required companies to import raw products, which actually there were alternatives in Indonesia. So what Ferdy and his team did was started to lobby the national government, and by getting experts and by lobbying, we actually got Bappenas and the Ministry of Agriculture to actually go to the field with us, and based on that field visit, they then, in the budget, committed $144 million, the equivalent of Australian dollars, to actually do feed trials to see whether or not they could use local bahan pokok, what's that in English? Raw materials to actually increase the quality of the feed without having to, actually it's about reducing the standards but maintaining the quality. And I'm pleased to say that the government agreed to change the food policy, so now there will be 3 levels of feed, all which will be certified, all which will pass government regulations. But not only that, the work of Prisma with Ferdy and his team has meant that the government have decided now to change the national standards for all feed, for all animals in Indonesia, which means that, you know, we're talking about real systemic change, not only in the cattle industry. So what does that mean for Mugi? It means that he's reduced his fattening time from 18 months to 4 months. It means that instead of having 1 cow, he now has 15. He can rotate those cows every 6 months. Instead of $50 profit for a cow, he now receives $780 per cow every 6 months, turning over his 15 cows. So that's a significant increase in his income. And in terms of overall food productivity, that measures to a 6% increase in total cattle production in Indonesia. And that's what we call systemic change. In the 1 minute that I've got remaining, I'll just talk a little bit about what Ivan is doing, and he's working in the mung bean sector. When we talk about systemic change, we talk about wider market change. We're also working in mung beans. In Indonesia, they only use retained seed for mung beans, which really reduces productivity. So what we decided to do is to work with the private sector to convince them to produce and to access, through the government, parent seed to create certified seed, a market for certified seed. Now, having done that, we've gone from 0% of certified seed in the Indonesian market to now 13% of mung bean seed in Indonesia being certified, which significantly increases productivity. Now, We did that in East and Central Java. But this is Jovita. She's from Malacca, which is the most eastern part of Indonesia you can find, and she is using that certified seed. So it is just showing that once you actually get the private sector engaged, once you can get enough private sector partners copying, and that's with no co-investment from us, you can actually get much wider outreach. And Jovita, she was producing 500 kilograms per season, and now she's gone up with no other support. She's gone up to 1.1 tons per planted season, which for her significantly increases her income. So, in closing, with the last 30 seconds, with increased food price volatility, particularly as a result of COVID and now the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, there's been, and also increased climate pressure, food security is becoming more tenuous. And we're convinced that both the systems approach and working with the private sector is actually a very effective way to deliver development aid at scale. It produces value for money and it creates permanent change for the better. And I'd just like to thank my team members for all the hard work that they've done, along with the other 130 members of our staff. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thanks so much, Gina.
And on time.
Very on time, and some really wonderful examples of positive change and impact at different levels, so thank you for that, it's fantastic. I realised that in my excitement to get going at the start, I actually neglected to introduce myself. So I'm your chair for the day. My name is Hortle. I'm the Research and Operations Manager at Sustineo, which hopefully some of you are familiar with, but if you're not, come and have a chat to me afterwards. Moving on to our second presentation today, we are very lucky to have Johannis and Ellie Wong with us. Diana's the Inclusive Economic Development Advisor at World Vision, and Ellie is the Economic Empowerment Manager. And they're going to talk to us today about realising sustainable economic development, gender equality and environment outcomes in practice, which I'm really looking forward to. Thank you guys.
Thanks Robert, to use the mic. Great to be here today to talk about our session on transforming agri-food systems to promote inclusion, women's economic empowerment and climate resilience. And we're going to talk about evidence and lessons from World Vision's programs in the Asia Pacific. So agriculture is a key source of food and income for the world's poor, especially with women playing an especially critical role. But how do we transform agri-food systems to be more inclusive and to work better for the poor, especially women? To answer this question, World Vision Australia worked with the Kenneth Lab to do a review of the impact and effectiveness of our programs working in this space. These were funded by the Australian NGO Cooperation Program and the European Union. And it looked at 11 programs, largely in the Asia Pacific, including Indonesia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Timor-Leste, Cambodia, PNG, and Vanuatu. The key limitations, however, in relation to this quantitative and qualitative data review were that the COVID-19 pandemic, which was impacting the data quality, as well as the fact that there was uneven indicator usage across the programs. But what's our approach that we were looking at? World Vision's approach to transforming agri-food systems involves three key areas: inclusive market systems development, financial inclusion, and women's economic empowerment. And households and children are at the centre of our work. So we work at two levels. First, working to incentivise market actors to change the way they work to benefit the poor, as well as thinking about ways to accelerate the participation of vulnerable households through targeted knowledge transfer, market linkages, etc. And this extends to nutrition awareness as it relates to food security and nutrition outcomes. When we think about women's economic empowerment, we can think about these two levels. Working on gender-inclusive business models that engage women as consumers, employees, and producers. But also thinking about the additional strategies that are necessary to promote women's economic empowerment, looking at gender-based constraints such as social norms and unequal gender relations. When we're thinking about sustainable agri-food systems and the climate crisis, needing to extend one level again further, thinking about climate-smart business models and strategies to promote household resilience to diverse shocks. So what were the findings from our review? All 11 programs were contributing to changes in multidimensional poverty, food security, as well as World Vision's indicators around child wellbeing, including the ability to provide for children's health and nutrition, as well as improvements in income and productivity. And what were our key learnings? I think our key learnings were that a hybrid approach that focuses on both market systems change as well as direct activities to address the barriers faced by vulnerable groups were more successful than those that did not adopt this approach. I think the key challenges that we face and that we often face in the economic development and agri-food systems space is the trade-offs that inevitably happen between reaching scale quickly and promoting inclusion of different groups. In relation to household level interventions that were really important in promoting inclusion, we had some key learnings. The first one is that savings groups and financial literacy interventions were more likely to increase the results in terms of our indicators around financial resilience and resilience to shocks. Layering additional nutrition activities targeted at the household level were more likely to see changes in nutrition and food security at the household level. And finally, those programs that promoted an intentional women's economic empowerment approach had improved likelihood of households, households' ability to provide for their children, including health costs. So how did we define women's economic empowerment as World Vision, and how did we look at it in the review? So we adopt a holistic approach to women's economic empowerment, prioritising 4 key domains: economic advancement or income and jobs, access to opportunities and resources, agency, including decision-making, manageable workloads and well-being, and finally equitable systems, thinking beyond the individual women to the systems that, to the broader systems, the formal systems, policies and legal frameworks, as well as the informal systems such as supportive social norms. And the findings show that those programs that did adopt that intentional approach were more likely to see changes across the domains. So programs were more likely to see increased number of women accessing, improving incomes, a greater proportion of women accessing new opportunities and resources, as well as improvements in productive and non-productive decision-making, including the decision-making in the domestic sphere, such as how income should be spent in relation to children. Programs also saw an increased likelihood to see satisfaction with time use, as well as improved attitudes towards women's economic participation. So what did these intentional women's economic empowerment programs actually look like? They sort of prioritise 2 key things: gender-inclusive business models that improved women's access, as well as gender-transformative activities that promoted women's agency and supportive social norms, and these led to better outcomes for women and children. I think the key lesson for us in relation to scaling gender-transformative activities is that there are a different type of activity, an activity that sort of seeks to challenge norms and unequal relations by encouraging equitable alternatives. You can see an example here on the slide of our gender-inclusive financial literacy training, which is encouraging women's voices in relation to household budgets. And when we're thinking about this, it takes time to build relationships with local actors and incentivize them, both non-commercial incentives, to adopt the kind of messages that we're trying to promote and we're trying to see. And it really does take time and dedicated resourcing. What did this look like in more detail with the data? Programs with gender transformative activities were more likely to see changes in attitudes towards women's participation, in the programs that adopted this approach in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh compared to those that didn't in Myanmar, Cambodia and South Sudan. So let's just dive a little bit into Bangladesh, which specifically looked at food security and nutrition, which was operating in Jamalpur. So in Jamalpur, when we started the program, there was limited private sector presence and a lack of access to quality agri-inputs. Women were participating in agriculture, but were undervalued and under-recognised. And in Bangladesh, where there's high rates of stunting, women and girls eat less and less. In relation to women's decision-making, one of the participants said usually male members of the family manage the money which is earned from the land. And women's experiences in markets are shaped by harmful social norms. For example, in our formative assessments, there were perceptions like, if women go to the agricultural land, crop production would be less. So what was our approach? Selecting subsectors where women can benefit, and engaging the private sector to come to Jamalpur for the first time by organising farmers into producer groups and helping them to collectively buy and sell. Initially, private sector weren't that interested in working with women because they didn't think that women had decision-making ability in relation to the purchasing of inputs. Now, this was overcome with time with a strong business case. To promote women's agency, we worked with an NGO called Promundo on their men-care model, as well as adapting the gender-inclusive financial literacy training package I mentioned. And this kind of operates in a different way to kind of more market systems or value chain development work, and encourages men and women to talk about household relations in relation to the provision, sharing, care work in the household, and those types of topics, as well as layering nutrition activities specifically for Bangladesh in relation to infant, young child and feeding practices. And we're able to see improved wee and child nutrition outcomes as well. So in terms of the results, we're able to see 67% increase in income for the 20,000 households this project looked at, a large proportion of whom are women, increased agency, including male engagement in the care work, as well as improved attitudes towards women's economic participation. Although we had less progress with attitudes towards gender-based violence. And this was able to also see changes in child nutrition, including children receiving improved meal frequency. So just in sum, just to keep in sum, the key points from our review and the recommendations are that to promote inclusion, we need to address market systems change, as well as being really intentional about the barriers faced by vulnerable groups, so they can participate but also benefit from agri-food systems. And to sustainably catalyse women's economic empowerment outcomes, we need a holistic approach. Social norms are part of the market systems. We need a holistic approach when we're thinking about this. If the women in Chile, in Jamalpur aren't benefiting because of restrictive social norms, then the whole system is constrained. And finally, to promote climate resilience, we need to better define what success looks like. And our review really, to be honest, didn't really get to this too much because we didn't have as much quantitative data. But I'll hand over now to Diana, who's going to speak more to that.
Thank you, Ellie. So in World Vision, we using three perspectives when we try to integrate environment and climate action into agri-food system. So the first perspective is risk perspective, when we see what is the existing hazard or environmental risk that might affect people's life and livelihood. Vice versa, we using the negative impact perspective to see what is in the people's life or agriculture and business activity that might doing harm the environment. The third one is we try to see what is the great opportunity at the environment and in the people life and agriculture and business activities that can support each other, especially to support the sustainability of those three outcomes. How we implement these three perspectives is we try to identify and align the benefit and incentive of all actors, not just farmers, not just the middle actors, but also the private sectors and the public sectors. As example, I hope you can see me. That was my screen. As example, a Moringa project in eastern Indonesia. This project actually is the economic development project who try to integrate these three perspectives. So the project find it healthy and other vegetable farmers in East Nusa Tenggara has been facing a loss their income because of the cyclone. So the project intervention is they provide disaster and risk reduction and climate change training at the household level, but also working together with the credit union to promote gender inclusive financial literacy. This training or package is including increasing financial capacity of the household to have emergency saving, including manage their income to support their production activities. This in line with the incentive of the credit union to cover more members, to cover more saving, including emergency saving, and support their member to have production loan. The second one that has been mentioned by the private sectors, they saw the increasing of the use of uncontrolled chemicals input in Indonesia because the farmers want to increase their productivities. This can harm the environment. So the project working together with the same private sectors to open the distribution channel of biofertilizers. This again aligns with the incentive to get more profit by selling biofertilizers. Biofertilizer itself is processed from the food waste from the big city in Jakarta. So it also supports the solution of the issue of food waste in the main city. And this can also help the farmers to get more productivity in healthy and safety way that can support sustainable environment. The last one, we try to identify what is the green opportunity. We're thinking about support the carbon market in the futures. Thank you. Support the carbon market in the futures, and it means support of the sustainable forest. But the project found the farmers often taking down the tree, including pilina trees, because they feel there is no other value from the trees. So the project working together with Timur Rasa, the national company, to open the new market at the national level to open the new market for the farmers. So this aligns with the Timur Rasa because they want to collect more pilina from the farmers and sell it to the market. The farmers itself feels that now they have more value from the trees and taking care of the forest. From the from the project evaluation after 5 years intervention, we found the same with Prisma that the project has collect the co-investment from many actors, from farmers, middle actors, and the private sectors, as the total 5.8 million Australian dollar. As the impact is the project success to cover 9,600 households in the Eastern Indonesia with the total income is 6.3 million. It means 2.8 of the project cost. This impact has led the private sectors and the market actors to continue to adopt the new practice, the new business model. And also for the farmers, because of this benefit, they're willing to continue and taking care of their environment, including the pilina farmers. Even they're not only taking care of the pilina tree, but they also start to replanting the pilina tree. And it support the government Indonesia to about the sustainable forest. For us, this is still a big, this is a homework, how we can also measure better about those three perspectives, not just about the income, but also about measuring the environment. So for us, the environment and climate issue have to identify the incentive for all actors for the short benefit and the long-term benefit. So they will willing to adopt the new business model, willing to adopt the new practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've looked at changing the order, but we're stuck with the one in the program. Thank you so much. Again, really practical examples of development interventions having really positive effects. So thank you for that. We now have Graham Walker from the Centre for Public Awareness of Science here at ANU. Graham's going to present on participation and agency in in school garden food security intervention. So he's comparing case studies from Kenya and PNG, which sounds fascinating. Thanks, Greg.
Lovely. Thank you. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge the members of my team that can't be here: Amy, Kenneth, Trudie, Robyn, and also all the teams on the ground building these gardens, operating these gardens, and the teachers and schools who are beneficiaries of them. So today I'm going to tell you a story of two different school gardens. And we've picked these two as case studies because they really show different ways that you can establish school gardens. I'm going to focus on establishment because that's where the projects are up to, but it's also where culture gets set, and if things go wrong in establishment, they have long-term impacts for what actually happens in those gardens, or doesn't happen. So in Papua New Guinea, it was a top-down project, the Morobe School Garden Project, partnership between DFAT and various local organisations. So very much a top-down project, and I don't say that to judge it, just to describe it, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Now, the contrast, or the kind of the yin for this yang, is a project that we were involved with in Kenya. Very much bottom-up, in fact, started in a backyard in the founder's own garden by an NGO called the Fun and Education Global Network. Check them out, they're doing some great stuff, very grassroots, very much bottom up. So just to put it in context, both of these countries have big problems with childhood malnutrition and stunting. Obviously a human tragedy, a lot of early death, a lot of disability and things right throughout life due to it. It's also very expensive, as you can see out there, over 500 million just in a year in PNG. So a lot of the bigger picture has to do with the changes in diet. A lot of the traditional foods have been replaced by essentially Western junk food, and that's having impacts around non-communicable diseases, but also in childhood malnutrition. So school gardens are a really nifty way to address this. We all know what a resource-constrained environment looks like, so if you can find an intervention that's doing multiple different things all at once, that is a really good place to start. And school gardens run well are one of those, so they can bring education benefits, we can get health and nutrition outcomes, they can improve food security, provide livelihoods and agribusiness for individuals, but also for schools. So one of the schools in PNG, huge amounts of money from revenue from selling their vegetables. And it gives young people, career development and life skills. What we find in school gardens as well is that if you want to change nutrition, this is very different to the kind of education you can do in the classroom. It really does translate into better food in people's bellies, done well. In low and middle income countries, like we were focusing on in this project, you see these agriculture, health, food and nutrition knowledge outcomes, and the kids will tell you, yeah, we're going to eat more vegetables, we've been in the garden, we're engaged. But knowledge, as in a lot of cases, does not translate into behaviour. You do see other improvements in deep world vision, and people were active up in these projects, so you see good wash outcomes and engagement with the community. But if you want to really change the nutritional outcomes for these young people, you need to look at the whole system, and you need to look at where most of their food is coming from, which is in the home and outside the school environment. Wonderful case study from Nepal, where they built these wonderful gardens. Kids say, yeah, we love vegetables, we're going to eat more. They don't actually do it until teams went into the households, educated the parents, particularly the mothers, and provided that education and gave them seeds. And then you saw these nutritional outcomes. So you've got to treat the entire system. We were looking at establishment, so we really looked at the what the origin story of these two projects was. Both began as pandemic responses. In Papua New Guinea, it started as an employment. A lot of people had lost livelihoods during COVID, and they thought, let's get them building gardens. So it was an employment and food security intervention. Then it turned into more focus on school feeding and revenue, and finally education. The way those goals shifted over time had a big impact on what this project was able to do. In Kenya, very much the opposite of that. It started in the backyard of this gentleman here. This is Ken from Kenya. Really passionate, he's an agricultural researcher, but really passionate about youth empowerment as well. Started in his backyard, then he saw lots of kids in his community and more broadly that were locked down, started an education program online, and then kids that had done this online education program actually took the project back into their schools when the lockdown ended. So it's really driven from the bottom up, and it was literally the young people's agency. So very different contrast there. And that really affected who participated and when, and who was able to make decisions and who had the power. Just to look very quickly at participation, successful gardens are ones that are really well integrated with the schools. So using the garden, you need a school garden, not a garden out of school. So having it integrated with the curriculum, getting students using it a lot. Obviously, we need sustainability and funding, and we need structures to look after it. That's what makes it successful. The way students participate, I should say, you'd think a school garden, that implies participation from the school, but if it's not driven by the school, if it's donor driven, and maybe the initial goals aren't around education, it's not, it doesn't necessarily follow that schools are going to be participating. And because of the ways the goals changed in Papua New Guinea, we saw this at the beginning of this project. With students, getting them active in the garden is really critical. So when students are making decisions, they're using the garden a lot, they get into it, they believe in what they're doing, they're intrinsically motivated, they'll come and use the gardens after school. Okay, that's where we want to go, and that's what actually changes their diets and what they're doing outside of school. If the model is too teacher-centred and students aren't using it enough, then we see the opposite. We see students aren't so motivated, that flows on to teachers, and they're unlikely to apply that learning outside of school. So student participation and youth agency is really critical to the kind of outcomes. You can grow lots of vegetables, but if you want to see changes in diet and you want to see young people getting passionate about growing good food, then we need to change that model. We looked at these two models using Reed's Wheel of Participation. It's from environmental engagement, but it's a really good model for looking at this. And Reed and colleagues don't set out to go, ooh, top down, that's better, bottom up. And I'm sure everyone in the room might have a preference there. But really, what Reed says is that we want to look at the actual outcomes. How it's put together is important, but it's not as important as what the difference it actually makes on the ground. So Reed's Wheel, we've got bottom up and top down, and we've got these different ways of engaging. Are we just communicating at people? Are we consulting them about decisions that affect them? Are we deliberating, working things out together? Or are we truly co-producing things and building this project together with the school? When we looked at this in these two projects, you saw this real contrast, okay? In Kenya, due to the way it was established and kids bringing it into the schools, students and teachers were leading. It was very much bottom up, and with everything, right down to the kids deciding which crops they plant and things like that. What that translated into is really deep engagement by those schools and really solid educational outcomes. The contrast in Papua New Guinea, the initial focus of these projects was around employment and infrastructure development. Education came very late to the piece, and what that meant is that the engagement was really limited, and the participation and the kinds of communication were quite different. And what we saw there is getting the educational outcomes off the ground right at the end of the project, kind of as an afterthought, was really, really difficult. Looking at how youth were involved, you've probably all seen ladder models like this. This is Hart's ladder of youth participation based on Arnstein's famous ladder. Down here we've got where kids are part of it, tokenism, decoration and manipulation, but they're really not exercising any agency, okay? This was, frankly, kind of the situation in Papua New Guinea. Often classroom teachers and students were not engaged in the decision making, how the gardens would look, things like that. Over in Kenya, it was very much up on these higher rungs of the ladder where youth were making decisions. In fact, youth founded these projects in the schools, and that agency that they had led to very different outcomes in both in the kind of educational work that these projects could do. When we wanted to look at youth participation a bit more deeply, we used this model from Share and Train, which it again is all about the kind of levels of agency the students have, but it gives a better model for project implementers to reflect on their own practice and go, all right, what do we need to change to give youth more of a voice? So it breaks these different levels into ideas like, are we ready as an organisation, as the way this project is being managed, to give youth more of a voice? Is there actually an opportunity for that? And these two things have very much happened in Kenya. Finally, is there an obligation? Does the project mandate youth participation? The amazing thing in Kenya, Ken and his team, when they went into the schools, they said, we're not going to run this project unless you give the youth a voice and you let them make the decisions. Now, this had a bit of a cultural clash. I heard in the previous session some work being done in the Solomons, in Papua New Guinea, if I'm not mistaken, where the quote was, students or young people are there to be seen, not heard. So you've got this cultural norm, and that has to be respected, and it has to be negotiated sensitively. Where that translates into the classroom is you see a lot of rote learning, you see students as passive observers rather than active participants in their learning. And that was how it played out because of the way it was established, because of these cultural norms. It played out like that in Papua New Guinea. In in Kenya, the opposite happened. And it took an insider. It's not for me as an outsider to go in and say, try more active learning, it's going to work better than rote learning. We needed someone who was part of that culture and could negotiate that in a respectful way with the teachers. As it turned out, he negotiated it in quite a kind of drive a truck through it way, but he was able to do it in a way that certainly if I tried that, it would not have gone well. So cultural norms really do affect things. Going back to Reid and his model, I said he doesn't judge top down or bottom up, but what the model gives you is some things that are underneath that point to whether you're going to see good outcomes. He breaks them down, or so they break them down into context, design, power, and scalar fit. When we looked at these two projects across these dimensions, the context, particularly the existing participation culture, students and teachers were not participating early in the project in Papua New Guinea, and it was really hard to get them to participate later. Okay, so that context was really important. As far as the design, they were locked out. The ultimate beneficiaries of the project were locked out in Papua New Guinea, and the financial kind of outcomes were prioritised. Okay, so those power and design really didn't fit where the project wanted to go in the end, which was around education. The scalar fit was also poor as well. Okay, it was really important to engage all the stakeholders right from the beginning, not to add them on as your goals became more or less important. We saw this in narrative interviews that we did with the project managers in Kenya. They're very much about empowering youth right from the beginning, and that really changed the culture within those projects. Whereas, and hindsight is a wonderful thing, when we talked to the project managers in Papua New Guinea, one of their reflections was, we wish we'd done this at the beginning because it was a lot harder to come in towards the end and make it happen. So, very briefly, some quick conclusions. I'm getting a death stare from the chair. As I said, we need to engage everyone from the start, and particularly those quiet voices, okay? Youth, there could be cultural factors here, but we still need to create a space for them to have a say. One of the ways of doing that is mandating that student participation, and we need to respect the culture as we do that as well. Resources were really critical for participation. We had to fight to get physical resources to the schools because that's not where the focus of the establishment of this project was. That became a big barrier for participation. Connecting with families and community was a really important thing to I guess, promote that wider participation. And finally, a kind of bigger picture reflection on this is places like school gardens are a good place where you can kind of change some of those cultural norms and particularly educational norms, get students and teachers operating in a different physical environment, which removes some, or at least mitigates some of those, I think, wider educational norms that are holding kids back to some respect in these countries. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thanks Graham. Such a really interesting exploration of what is sort of on the surface a beautifully simple idea, but is clearly much more complex to implement. So thank you. We're lucky now to be joined by two of my colleagues from Sustineo, Dr. Matt Allen and Ellis McKenzie. Ellis is a research consultant with Sustineo and Matt is our principal consultant in research. And they're going to present on exploring the potential for carbon trading in Papua New Guinea's smallholder coffee sector and look at some institutional and governance considerations for us. Thanks guys.
Thank you, Rob. Good morning, everyone. I'm told I have a very loud voice and I wouldn't normally use a microphone, so please let me know if it starts to become too loud. Ellis and I are presenting this morning, but we'd like to acknowledge our co-authors for this paper who are listed on the screen there. We're going to be talking about presenting some research, and the title of our presentation is Exploring the Potential for Carbon Trading in Papua New Guinea's Smallholder Coffee Sector, Institutional and Governance Considerations. So in terms of a brief overview of the project, in 2020 we undertook research as part of a DFAT-funded project titled Improving Rural Livelihoods via Exploring Carbon Sequestration and Trading Opportunities in PNG's coffee industry. And the broader study is assessing the feasibility of establishing a carbon offset scheme in Papua New Guinea's smallholder coffee industry. And for our part of the project, we focused on understanding the governance and institutional requirements. And in doing so, we've adopted a very broad perspective on governance and institutions. So we've been looking at governance at multiple scales, from the international level through to the community level. And we're also adopting a very broad approach to institutions. So we understand institutions to include both organisations, governments, NGOs and so on, as well as the rules of the game, both formal law and regulation and informal customary norms and practices, which are incredibly important in a context such as Papua New Guinea. So in terms of a brief overview of this brief presentation, we'll be presenting our research objectives and our research methods. I'll then be providing some background and context both on the smallholder coffee industry and the recent history of carbon trading in Papua New Guinea. And I'll then hand over to Ellis to present some of our key findings and to conclude by highlighting some challenges and opportunities. So our objectives briefly were to explore the institutional landscape for coffee production and carbon trading in Papua New Guinea, the potential for smallholder coffee growers to engage with carbon trading, and also to identify some stakeholders that could potentially contribute to a coordinated approach to coffee production and carbon trading. And we adopted a mixed methods approach for the study. We undertook a detailed desk assessment, semi-structured key informant interviews and a stakeholder workshop. So we conducted 31 key informant interviews with international stakeholders, being voluntary carbon standards, payments for eco-services project managers and academics. And we also interviewed a raft of PNG-based stakeholders, including government, coffee industry stakeholders, civil society, donor and development organisations. So in terms of some context on coffee in Papua New Guinea, Approximately 400,000 smallholders produce around 85% of PNG coffee. However, it's estimated that around 3 million Papua New Guineans benefit either directly or indirectly from the coffee industry. The sector faces a raft of well-known challenges, the lack of government support services, limited credit, high transport costs, and crime and safety concerns. And for these reasons and others, notably the depressed price of coffee on international markets for many years now, the smallholder coffee sector has really been in a state of stagnation and decline really for the past 4 decades now. That said, in recent times, over the last 10 years or so, there has been quite a rapid increase in the production and export of specialty coffee under certification standards such as Fair Trade, Organic and Rainforest Alliance. It's important to note that the coffee sector in PNG is extremely gendered. Coffee is very much regarded as a men's crop, and whilst women contribute to its production, it's really men who control the income from coffee at the end of the day. So some brief background on carbon trading in Papua New Guinea. So since 2007, there's been a lot of interest in carbon trading following the progression of the REDD+ agenda through the UNFCCC. But the uptake of REDD+ has been extremely problematic. Attempts to establish REDD+ projects have resulted in land disputes and the advent of so-called carbon cowboys. And in response to these challenges, as well as allegations of corruption, the PNG government is seeking to establish a more coordinated national approach to carbon trading, and recently adopted earlier this year a moratorium on REDD+ projects that target voluntary carbon markets. And we understand that the moratorium will be lifted at such time as the new regulatory framework is in place. Despite these challenges, the Climate Change and Development Authority, the CCDA, has registered around 200 expressions of interest for carbon trading projects, including from smallholder cash crop producers. However, according to the CCDA, there are only 2 active projects operating in PNG at the moment, both REDD+ type projects, and both have been plagued by the types of challenges that I just highlighted. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Ellis now to present some of the study findings.
Thank you, Matt. So, yeah, our findings on the different sort of governance components for a project like this are broken down into a few different thematic areas. So, I'll talk about the policy and legislative requirements, capacity in the coffee sector, land tenure and how this intersects with gender relations in the coffee industry, and finally touching on the issue of co-benefits. So first, it's important to establish that we're focused in this study on voluntary carbon markets rather than compliance markets. So at a high level, a key difference here is with voluntary carbon markets, individuals or organisations can voluntarily choose to purchase carbon credits to offset their carbon footprint, rather than compliance markets where this is mandated as part of national, regional or international carbon reduction regimes. So with voluntary carbon projects in developing country contexts, the approach used is typically this model of minimal government engagement. So government stakeholders are sometimes notified in the host country to sort of seek approval, but beyond that they're typically not involved directly in the project. Similarly, international carbon standards and project managers have tended not to emphasise the conditions needed for an enabling policy approach. So given that voluntary carbon markets involve minimal, if any, state regulation, the governance and compliance requirements of the carbon standard itself are paramount to determine the arrangement for any given project, and there are some variations between the different standards. However, a finding from our study from engaging with stakeholders in Papua New Guinea is that this approach of minimal government engagement is unlikely to be suitable to the context of Papua New Guinea. And this is because of the weak regulatory environment and current moratorium on voluntary REDD+ projects, which indicates that meaningful engagement may be required to ensure adherence with the new regulatory framework. So when we look at capacity in the coffee industry in Papua New Guinea, Private sector stakeholders are increasingly playing an important role in certifications throughout the coffee supply chain. The majority of stakeholders we spoke to highlighted that coffee farming groups already engaged in the specialty coffee market have greater capacity than those who are not. And compared to other cash crop sectors, coffee has better developed supply chains, more engaged exporters, and more established certification schemes. And one of our key findings here was that there's opportunities for voluntary carbon projects to piggyback off some of these synergies in the coffee industry. So this is particularly around sort of overlapping interest in things like the broader focus on good governance, as well as the sort of capacity development and extension services that are being provided, as well as similar processes of monitoring, verification, and reporting. So issues to do with customary land ownership are some of the most significant challenges for carbon trading projects in Papua New Guinea. And this is particularly around things like landowner identification, land boundary mapping, and gaining the consent of landowners. So demonstrating secure land ownership is a requirement to meet carbon sequestration permanency obligations under these voluntary carbon standards. And this is typically done through secure individual land titles. However, stakeholders in Papua New Guinea have emphasised that the process for registering customary lands, along with other legal processes for securing formal land titles, are lengthy and unlikely to be successful. However, there are opportunities to adopt an approach to land tenure arrangements that is more compatible with local contexts. So importantly, in other examples across the Pacific, we're seeing uses of like land boundary mapping exercises, as well as the signing of MOUs with neighbouring landowners and local authorities. And then in Papua New Guinea itself, you can also see examples of planned land usage agreements, which are more compatible with customary land tenure arrangements, and these have been used in the oil palm sector with some success. So another important finding is that in the context of the Papua New Guinea highlands, where most of the coffee is grown, coffee ownership is typically very stable. Coffee plants last 20 to 40 years, and many coffee plots are in current use are 50 to 60 years old. Again, in the highlands, land tenure is significantly more individualized compared to other areas of Papua New Guinea, and coffee blocks are recognized as belonging to individuals and are rarely sold. So these factors, lend themselves better to the requirements of a carbon trading project. As Matt mentioned earlier, coffee is a male-dominated cash crop, with the male head of the household typically owning the land and the coffee trees, and subsequently controlling the income from the sale of coffee. Our findings did also identify the potential for perverse gender outcomes from a project like this. So, one issue is that if a project like this does increase the income for farmers, it could encourage the expansion of coffee farms. And this could see, coffee replacing high-value vegetable crops that tend to benefit women more than men. So it's important to be cognizant of these sort of gender impacts. It's also worth recognising that coffee certification programs, such as Fair Trade, have made significant progress in improving women's participation, particularly through their sort of capacity development and extension training services around good governance. So, carbon sequestration in coffee trees is actually quite low, which means that a project focused on carbon in coffee alone is unlikely to be viable. However, there is growing interest across the carbon trading sector in projects that not only sequester carbon, but also improve the biodiversity and generate other socio-economic co-benefits. So these co-benefits are the environmental, economic, social, and cultural benefits achieved in addition to carbon sequestration. And projects that factor these co-benefits can attract a greater premium for the carbon credits that they generate. So we also found that there are additional carbon and non-carbon benefits from improving the management of existing coffee agroforestry systems in Papua New Guinea, particularly around considering things like planting density, as well as the use of shade trees on coffee farms. So finally, I just want to reflect on some of the key challenges and opportunities when you consider implementing a project like this. So to begin with the challenges, there are clear capacity constraints at all levels, from the community level to the highest level of government. And the troubled history of REDD+ in Papua New Guinea is telling of the institutional capacity constraints for governing carbon trading. And to date, no projects have been implemented in the cash crop sector. The preference of voluntary carbon standards for secure land titles to meet permanency obligations is also disconnected from the reality of customary land tenure systems held by many rural smallholders in Papua New Guinea, which are dynamic and fluid. And the Papua New Guinea highlands is a highly patrilineal and patriarchal society, with cash crops tending to benefit men more than women. However, there are some important opportunities. So there has been sustained interest in carbon trading in Papua New Guinea for over a decade now, from both domestic and foreign actors, including growing interest among many key stakeholders in the coffee industry. Compared to other cash crop sectors, coffee best lends itself to a potential carbon trading project due to its developed supply chains, engaged exporters, and more established certification schemes, and the large number of smallholders who already benefit from coffee. The rise of specialty coffee in Papua New Guinea presents opportunities for synergies with carbon trading due to the need for compliance, extension services, and capacity building, and processes of monitoring, verification, and reporting. And the relative stable and individualized nature of coffee ownership in the highlands compared to other areas of Papua New Guinea is better suited to the demands of a carbon trading project. Finally, the growing interest in co-benefits incentivizes a more holistic approach that considers broader development benefits beyond carbon sequestration alone and makes these types of projects more financially viable. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks so much, Ellis and Matt. Some fantastic potential there, but also some pretty big challenges to overcome, it would seem. So we're doing very well for time, so we've got plenty of time for questions from the room. I'm sure people have many questions after those presentations. I'm going to take questions in groups of 2, I think. So please, a couple of things, direct your question to a panel member, if at all possible. And I'd also ask that you really keep your questions brief and to the point, please. Not the opportunity for personal anecdotes. We want to get the most that we can out of these fantastic panel members up here, so don't make me go all sort of Tony Jones on you. So questions in groups of 2. I saw there was one up here, and then I saw one in the middle there at the start. And I'm going to move around the side. Matt and Ellis, do you want to come up around the front here? Yes, and microphones. Perfect.
Yes, thank you very much. I think all the presentations very, very interesting, and thank you so much for bringing all these observations all together, so we all can go several parts of the world in 1 hour. So my first question is, I think possibly to the first presenter. I really like the impact and the contribution of the private sector here, especially contributing the smallholders. My issue of question or the comment here is, so there is a variation in smallholder as well, because there are very, very small holders near landless, and I'm not sure how the project has contributed to those landholders. And the most important question is, so definitely the way you are presenting and the achievements you are doing, it might have contributed a lot of the youth who migrate in many countries outside for manual labor, and then I don't know whether you have some observation how it has contributed to that sector of migration for manual job. Can I ask another question for second presenter?
Can we just leave it there?
Yeah,
I'll share with questions, so we're trying to get one each person. And we've got up the centre here, so we've got that noted down for Mia. Great. Oh, can I also just ask that you give your name and your affiliation to?
Goodness, all these directions. Keep the microphone close to me. Yeah, Dave Shearer, sort of ANU and some other areas. So my question's sort of to Nina, but I'm going to quick spin across the panel. So Nina, you know, what the evidence would suggest about engagement with the private sector, that some benefit from that engagement. And from a certification point of view, it's clear that only some benefit. So the overall development objective and the sustainable objectives of development aren't met, okay, from the approach of the private sector. And although we hear it's systemic as you use, you still give examples of some people that benefit. Okay. Then we heard from the World Vision people that as we take a market systems approach, you know, we need to think about the design and how we design in the approach to tackle, to address some of the vulnerable groups, but still only some people benefit from that. The private sector's been on the agenda for a long period of time as making, you know, big scale changes within development outcomes. I still don't think we've got there. You know, we're still having benefits on some actors. We're not having benefits in development outcomes. How do we shift the role of the private sector to ensure we have sustainable development outcomes?
Great, thank you. Just a little question there. So Nina,
well, it's a big group, so we can have a big discussion.
Can we start with you, please, Nina, responding in whichever order you'd like.
Thank you for both of those questions. I will say we were only given 15 minutes. In terms of the variation of smallholders, yes, you're correct. That there are variations of smallholders. Where we focus is actually on the extreme poor. So this also touches a little bit on Dave's question. It was Dave, right? Right, Dave's question. We only measure on really smallholder farmers. So we're talking on farmers, cattle farmers who only have between 1 and 5 cattle. The work that we do actually also impacts on all other cattle farmers who end up using feed, for example. But we only measure those who we classify as small farmers or the extreme poor. In terms of manual labour, actually in a country of 270 million, you wouldn't have expected that there's actually a labour shortage in Indonesia, but there is. So one of the other interventions that we look at is mechanisation, because actually one of the major costs for smallholder programs or smallholder farmers is labour. We actually work with some smallholders, and I should take the word some out. We work with all smallholder farmers that work in, say, a particular sector. And one of those is actually woman-headed households whose husbands actually go overseas to make money, actually, to neighbouring countries. This isn't part of our mandate, but one of the things that you would expect, and actually your Vita is an example of that. One of the things that you would expect is that if through increased productivity they can increase their income, then it's likely that their husbands don't need to actually go overseas. So that's all that we deal with in terms of manual labour. Evidence in the private sector that only some benefit. I think that's the same for any development program. It's no different to private sector when you're working with the private sector. And I think one of the differences, and I can say this because I actually came from a livelihoods perspective, and then it was only 10 years ago that I started working with private sector. So I've seen both ends of the scale, and then I think here we've got an in-between scale where you use a twin track approach. So I think what you're more saying is that if you look at the work with the private sector, then it's very difficult to reach the most vulnerable. And so, again, because I only had 15 minutes, we weren't actually able to talk about the work that you actually do with the most vulnerable. Now, the only drawback that I would say in terms of working with the private sector is that you've got to be able to look at incentives that the private sector has. Now, when it comes to women, there are big incentives for the private sector to actually engage with women, which is what we've seen, I think, in most of the presentations. So one of the things that Prisma does is actually, 50% of the population in Indonesia, in the farming population, are women. And so you can actually develop good business models for the private sector to engage with women and to benefit more women. And so part of the work that we do is actually we look at the level of engagement and the level of control of all the sectors that we work in, but there are some, for example, coffee, where it's male-dominated. In those instances, you may not be able to do much in terms of accessing women, but you wouldn't have otherwise. So what we do more is that we look also at the we components, the women economic engagement components, to see if the money is coming through from the male household, how then can you actually get better engagement with the woman or agency in terms of using that. Now, if you want to work directly with the private sector, that's not something that you can do. So you do have to use what's called the twin track approach, which my friends have discussed in, for example, the Moringa program.
Thanks, Nina. On that note, can I get to hear from our World Vision colleagues on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with Nina that it really depends. It depends on the development outcome that you're trying to achieve. And I guess for World Vision, we're really concentrated on household level change. And in that focus on barriers for vulnerable groups, I think it's okay to recognize that there are some things that might be outside of the incentives or interests for the private sector to provide. So for example, layering nutrition, behavior change and infant young child feeding practices to dial up the purchasing of nutritious food and the demand at the household level. We can't expect the private sector to do that, and so we're gonna do that. Social norm change beyond making the business case, with looking at other actors in the system like community leaders, religious leaders, like influencers in a society that has farmers and women and micro businesses, etc., is justified when we're thinking about that women can't succeed if we don't change the supportive environments around them. So I think we are justified when we're thinking about, in this project, is it the nutrition and the gender equality angle that we're focusing on? And then having to make some trade-off decisions as it relates to scale, as it relates to who we're working with. So that Bangladesh program was working with the marginal poor at 20,000 households. We're working on another program in Bangladesh, same amount of money, about 5 million USD, working with 2,880 households using the ultra-poor graduation model. It had better income outcomes, it had higher poverty rejection, it has better progress on women's agency and social norms. But the cost per beneficiaries are really different, the scale is different. So at the start of the program, we have to make some tough calls, and then maybe not, I guess it's hard for one program to do everything, and let that program do what it is set out its intention to do in the first place, and maybe set out another program. I think sequencing could be something that we do better. So like calling in more commercial farmers first, and then if there are opportunities down the track, once we have engagement from the private sector to think about opportunities for the landless, opportunities for other groups. We don't necessarily have to engage all groups at the same time, but that would require longer timeframes for programs and like a more, I guess, segmented design process.
So I'm going to get a very quick comment from Matt on that and then take some more questions.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, just a quick response to the question on the role of the private sector. And the private sector did feature quite prominently in our presentation. And I'll just make two points. I mean, one is that in doing this research, we were really struck by the extent to which voluntary carbon markets are completely unregulated in many country contexts, including in Papua New Guinea. So as we said in the presentation, it's really down to the requirements of the carbon standards themselves to determine the particular governance requirements. As we noted, the co-benefits are becoming a huge thing in carbon markets. And the carbon standards, their core business is measuring, carbon sequestration, and they have really advanced established methodologies for that. Now they're developing methodologies for measuring, broader social, economic, livelihoods benefits. So they're effectively trying to measure development, and it's not like it's the first time anyone has tried to measure development. So, I think there's a lot of scope and potential for people who've been in the game for a long time, organisations, institutions, to work with the standards on developing those methodologies around co-benefits, because as it stands, a lot of it is left to, there are lots of actors in carbon markets, lots of resellers, intermediaries. There's a lot of spin, right, particularly around this co-benefits thing. So I think there is an opportunity there. Second point, Papua New Guinea, like not just in coffee but across the board, government extension services have really collapsed. So it's private sector actors who are stepping in to fill that void. And it's not all private sector actors, you know, the private sector in the coffee space is not homogenous. You know, some of the exporters are much more committed and activist in this kind of space than others. And they're not working alone. I mean, some of the certification standards such as fair trade, you know, they have a strong in-country presence, and they've been doing some excellent work, particularly around gender equality. And then the farmers themselves are organising, you know, they're forming producer groups, cooperatives and so on, so some of which are going really well. And then just finally, you know, there's recent evidence that the Coffee Extension Service, the Coffee Industry Corporation is starting to engage a little bit more, which is good news.
Thanks, Matt.
I'm Mike Burke, I'm a private consultant with affiliation with the ANU. Thanks for the presentation. This is Brian, but perhaps you want to comment on the question. You said at the start of your presentation, Brian, that there were two projects were in early stages, but the PNG one, as I understand, the late schools one, was shut down by DFAD. Could you comment on that? The question is that to do with your analysis or the other issues here?
We'll just grab the second question before I get Graham to answer.
Yes, hi, I'm Brandy, I'm from Sibley. I have a question for Nina and Ellie, and this is more framed in I would like to learn from your experience. So I'm just wondering if there are any existing market systems or resources that you leverage or could have leveraged in your work, and how do you ensure sustainability and scalability of your respective organizations' work within this area?
Great, thanks. Great, thanks to you.
Yeah, look, you're right. That project was shut down very quickly. We were, I can speak to you more about the details, but essentially we were given no reason why it was shut down, but I'm happy to have that chat later. The good news, we haven't collected any more data from those schools because we just felt that would not be appropriate, given that, yeah, frankly, they were engaged in this long development process and it was abruptly cut off with not a lot of kind of transitioning or anything. The opportunity that was sadly lost. At least two of those schools have picked it up and continued with it, despite not being supported by the project or the wonderful local team. Yeah, I spoke to some of the people that were involved yesterday, and yeah, two of those schools are still going strong. Yeah, so yeah, I can have a chat later, but it's all speculation, so I won't bring it into this room. But yeah, it was shut down quite abruptly, and yeah, frankly, with not a great amount of feedback to help us run the project better if we've done it again.
Thanks, Graham. Can we go to Ellie first on that second question, please?
The scalability and sustainability. Yes. Okay. In relation to the specific Bangladesh program example, in terms of thinking about sustainability of outcomes in relation to the relationship between the producer groups and the private sector, petrochem and bioseeds, we work to around intermediary service providers, like so in this context, community sales agents, so that they have a cut of they're getting some income from the role they're playing in facilitating the collective purchasing of inputs. And so I think World Vision's playing a temporary role in terms of market facilitation and connecting farmer groups to private sector and building their capacity. But I suppose we're hoping that, you know, the program's nearing to their end, that when we exit, that the community sales agents have incentives, they're making money and they're continuing to engage with petrochem and bioseeds like over time. In relation to the social norm work, I think it's really interesting around trying to think about applying market system development thinking to gender models that are really effective, whereas I think sometimes NGOs are implementing directly with communities, like the Monjero model, the Mentor model, it originally was implemented directly with communities, whereas we're thinking around, our lessons are around working with religious leaders who can carry on the gender norm change work or own it differently, and they can include it in their religious text or their religious engagement with communities after we leave. There was challenges with integrity, I think, well, not integrity, but whether or not we keep the whole gender model, which is difficult to sustain, it's like 14 weeks of training, or how do we get it to reach more people, which is winding it back. So that's why we've done this thing that Diana and I mentioned a few times, putting in the key gender models in the financial literacy training. And in the Indonesia context, we had the opportunity to work with the credit unions. And they're looking at the gender equality aspect as a way to improve their brand. And we're thinking about, well, how can we make the business case for this? Because actually we can think about, will this support things like better loan repayments? And in Indonesia as well, they're thinking about including sessions in the premarital counselling, which is interesting, and that idea came from the field team. So I think thinking about sustainability on multiple angles, we're thinking about commercial incentives, but we also want to think about like non-commercial incentives as well when we're looking at broader social systems.
Hi, I don't really have much more to add other than what Ellie has already said, but I think really it just comes down to you know that it will be sustainable if the private sector that you're working with adopts the new business model and it becomes part of core business. So that's when you really know that it's sustainable. And usually, if you're talking about, so that's sustainability of the organisation, but what's more important to us is the sustainability of the system. So in order to make that system more inclusive. And then you know that that's happened when you actually get other private sector partners, or not partners, just other private sector organisations copying the behaviour or responding to the behaviour or the new business model by adding new things to that model so that the actual market system becomes sustainable, which you actually see in the example of the beef case study. Now, I will give a little bit of a nod to Dave. Not all of these models work. So it's a little bit of trial and error working with the private sector. And so within our portfolio, you can expect that at least 30% of the interventions that you work in will not end up being sustainable.
Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to try and fit in one more question. Who we got out there?
I know you wanted to ask the second question though. She's not been on
That's all right, we'll spread it around.
Hi, it's Frances Dusan here. I'm from the Indo-Pacific Centre for Health Security at DFAT. And I'm going to ask Nina a question just regarding the trade-offs between animal production and animal health and welfare, and whether they were considered in the design of the project. They're not always trade-offs, but there are some associated risks.
Yeah, so I think for us, again, because of the 15 minutes, I could only actually talk about the feed function that we were working on, but we're also working on the animal health function. But even with the feed function, what we do is that part of the business model is that the private sector also passes on good rearing practices. And so, as you know, with Indonesia, you know, raising cattle is not always a pretty thing, if anyone saw the Four Corners program. And so really part of the way that we deal with that is actually looking at animal husbandry standards, and so we've adopted the Australian guidelines on animal welfare, and we try and get the private sector not to adopt wholesale, but to make changes in their business practices that at least are moving towards the Australian standards. The only thing I think that we're looking at now is the trade-off between climate change and animal production. But we're looking at some good work. In fact, Ferdy's actually come and he's having a meeting with an Australian company that is actually producing a feedlot that uses a particular seaweed that is only produced in Australia, and then trying to get that introduced into Indonesia, so that there's also trade opportunities there between Australia and Indonesia. But yes, I'm not sure if I answered fully your question, but
yeah, I guess, particularly relevant considering the outbreaks at the moment, and the greater number of animals are higher risk, obviously for the animals, but also for the production system itself.
yeah, so we're actually...
Sorry, we'll just have to leave.
But I'll take that out.
Yeah, if you guys can chat about
Yes, but I'm also doing a presentation on Thursday at DPAT, specifically talking about the work that we're doing in FMD, so foot and mouth disease. So yeah, if you can join that meeting, you'll get all the answers there.
Thank you. Thanks so much everyone for the discussion. Thank you.